Welcome to the Postgame of the Michael Brooks Show. Welcome to each and every one of you. Welcome to all patrons. Thanks to everybody on the team. Welcome, of course, the great Professor Richard Wolff, who is still with us. Understanding Socialism. I'm already seeing people talking about ordering the book on Twitter. Don't be left out. There's a tech problem here. A speaker's apparently blown out. And, well, to Matt, I'm not happy that it happened on TMBS, but are you happy that it happened on TMBS?
It is what it is.
I could see another scenario of, God damn it, the speaker. I was like,
luckily it'd be his fault though.
Oh, it would totally be, but that doesn't make any difference. I was just trying to build a new portal for it because I read about Handyman magazine. Like you could, Sam's meltdowns are so ingrained. I could actually like game them out in a fantasy, like a hypothetical scenario too. Just like the speaker isn't working. God damn it, Ben! Hold on. The horrible thing for me is that sometimes when he's having like a tech problem or something, one part of me is annoyed. Because it's just whatever, calm down. It's not that big of a deal. Another part of me is petrified that he's going to give himself an aneurysm, not another aneurysm, a aneurysm. And then a third part of me is fighting with every fiber of my being to stifle laughter. So I'm just getting a little bit out here. Just like, the speaker's broken. I can't hear him. Okay, and the person I'm trying to hear through this tech catastrophe is Ben Burgess, our friend. He's the author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. Actually, Professor Wolff is writing a response to your book called Give Them a Brick, The Streets for the Left. No, I'm just playing. He is, of course, a professor of logic. He teaches at Perimeter College at the part of the Georgia State University system in Georgia. He has a very good Patreon page. Ben, are you ready for your song?
Born ready.
Born ready. All right, here's Ben's song by Moondog. So please go.
Okay.
You got to restrain me. Debunk all of it. Logical analysis. You're going to show us how to argue that. He walks
this is
off
based
screen.
on data from a bunch of different countries. There's abundant evidence that at this point that that's bullshit.
You're just bouncing during your song.
Supposed to fit together.
Okay, break it down. Break it down. Break it down. All right, Ben, you have the iconic Professor Wolff here. Say hi to each other, please.
Hi, Ben. Glad to be talking to you again.
Great to see you again, Professor Wolff.
Ben, what are we debunking this evening?
This evening we are debunking Michael Brooks. Wow, that was a nice little slip. David Brooks.
That guy needs to change his name. I demand it.
Who you know is a really smart guy and really insightful because he's been given a column at the New York Times. So obviously he wouldn't be given that kind of journalistic push if he's going to do something good with it. And he wrote recently an opinion piece called "I Was Once a Socialist, and Then I Saw How It Worked."
So, Ben, I guess we've got some sound to go along with this. But first, neither Professor Wolff or I have been able to force ourselves to read this piece. So we're fresh.
Okay,
and
good.
We're counting on you to what's the phrase that you would like? Steelman his argument, or throw a bunch of personal insults. Either way, I'm happy. It's fine.
Well, no, this is good because you'll be like your mind will be blown afresh with every insight that he has to offer here. Since you haven't heard this before, I'm sure it's amazing. But all right, so First paragraph, we should go through this before we watch the clip because this sets it up.
Okay.
I was a socialist in college. I read magazines like The Nation and old issues of The New Masses. I dreamed of being the new next Clifford Odets, a lefty playwright who was always trying to raise proletarian class consciousness.
Oh, my God.
If you go
Even when it's cool, he was boring.
If you go on YouTube and search David Brooks, Milton Friedman, you can see a 22-year-old socialist me debating the great economist. I'm the one with bushy hair and the giant 1980s glasses that were apparently on loan from the Palomar Lunar Observatory.
Fuck you.
So if we follow his link, we can test this claim that when he was 22 years old, he was a socialist, and that this means that he can give this kind of insider critique.
Okay, we're ready. We're going to play this clip now. This is Milton Friedman and a young self-proclaimed socialist whose dream was to be a playwright that nobody's ever heard of, that wrote knockoffs of Death of a Salesman. That's my editorial. Okay, let's go.
Which we want to run, how we define private property, what we mean by private property. There's a role for government in adjudicating disputes between us. There is a role for government, a very important role. And I believe our government played that role quite well for about 100 years, until the Great Depression.
I'd go a little further. I think there is a health and safety role as well. The problem is you have to keep your regulations simple and minimal. You have to realize that there are costs, and often the costs outweigh the benefits.
Are we sure that this is when he was in college, though, or is this from later on?
Well, I don't know, but what's fascinating about this is that this is literally the clip that's linked in his piece. Okay,
because I am totally confused here. I thought, is this like a second meeting when Brooks is already starting to write for the Weekly Standard?
Yeah, I don't know. So either somebody at the New York Times screwed this up, or he really misremembered how much further he was to the left back then, because this is his link in his article takes us to this clip where he's taking a position that's like a quarter of an inch to the left of Milton Friedman. It's like Friedman's like, well, the government has a role to, in adjudicating disputes, minimal state. And Brooks says, well, I'd go a little bit further. It also has a health and safety role, but just like not too far. And like, I like the idea that this wasn't somebody at the New York Times screwed up and put it in the wrong clip, that this is just that like David Brooks now remembers that as, oh yeah, I was kind of a communist back then.
I'm going to have to go with it's a screw up because the timelines don't fit. By the time he's 1990, he's already, he's writing for the Weekly Standard. And I think he's already saying like, look, I mean, there should only be so much fecal matter allowed in pig products. Because if you eliminate all of it, then we have the Soviet Union. Yes, Professor Wolff.
Also a socialist, even the mildest, moderatest one, listening to the blather that's coming out of Milton Friedman. 100 years before the Depression, the government simply adjudicated disputes.
What the hell does that mean?
That he runs a court system or
right.
But could I just remind Mr. Friedman and those who are deluded by him, during that 100 years, there was a civil war in which the capitalist government of the United States destroyed the slave system in the South, took away the slaves from their masters and gave them no compensation. It took property from masses of people. In fact, the greatest investment of property was in the slaves for many, and that was taken from them with no compensation at all. They also slaughtered a vast number of Native Americans, stealing their land and their animals and their villages. The idea that the government before 1929 was limited to adjudicating disputes amongst us is a rewrite of history on the scale that would make a freshman get an F in a mediocre school. It's unbelievable that this could pass, and our Mr. Brooks here didn't have a single thing to suggest as to how this characterization of what the government did is inadequate.
By the way, I've heard libertarians complain, actually, that the big problem with the Civil War, not that there was this terrorist state in the South fighting to maintain slavery and feudalism, not even the enormous costs on both sides in terms of just pure numbers of deaths or the terrorism of the Confederate fighters and how the origins of that led to the Klan. The big problem was, and the fundamental injustice was, that Abraham Lincoln did, in fact, not offer restitution. Because that was a total violation of people's property rights, which they say unironically. And also, when they have enough self-awareness to realize that sounds as obscene as it sounds, that even if it was wrong that human beings were property, there was still contractual obligations. Right. So the right thing to do was to free the people, which, of course, you didn't need to have a war to free because it would have inevitably happened anyway because of capitalism. But if you were going to do it, you needed to definitely basically make sure that Leonardo DiCaprio's character in Django Unchained get a massive check, because whatever else you think of these barbarous murderer Confederates, they did have a deal broken. And that, just as Rand Paul's big insight of the entire struggle of the 50s and 60s against American apartheid was like, yeah, I understand a lot of things were going on, but Howard Johnson's managers were told that they had to serve coffee to human beings. Obviously, that was the biggest threat to liberty taking place, and the long tradition of libertarians having great values and making a lot of sense and being extremely historically informed. But anyways, Ben, I think we're back to David Brooks.
Yeah, I do want to throw in, by the way, that if you ever want to see an actual clip of a socialist talking to Milton Friedman, there's a great one on YouTube of Michael Harrington going at it with Friedman, and while Friedman is talking, Harrington looks like he's half asleep, and then he starts his rebuttal with the words, "Now back to the real world."
Right.
It's the appropriate response to Milton Friedman. But so as you read this, Brooks does start to, he tries to steel man us, right? He says, a few paragraphs down, the best version of socialism is defined by Michael Walzer's phrase, what touches all should be decided by all. The great economic enterprises should be owned by all of us in common. Decisions should be based on what benefits all, not the maximization of profits. Hey, sounds good, right? So what's wrong with that? Skip a couple more paragraphs down. My socialist sympathies didn't survive long once I became a journalist. I quickly noticed that the government officials I was covering were not capable of planning the society they hoped to create. It wasn't because they were bad or stupid. The world is just too complicated.
They like that one.
So just so we're keeping score so far, the world is too complicated for democratically elected officials who are accountable to the electorate as a whole to make decisions about how it works. But it's exactly simple enough for CEOs and wealthy investors to make those decisions.
Right. Yes. Any thoughts on the complicated idea, Professor?
Yeah, it just reminds me. It used to be in the days when we had kings and queens that they were the ones who explained to the rest of us who were merely subjects that governing was much too complicated in our big societies with kings and queens to be left to average mortals without the special link, usually to God or something like that, that kings and queens were thought to have, and that therefore democracy would never be relevant or appropriate because those decisions have to be made by people who are endowed with whatever that special sauce is that makes you a king or a queen. In response to that sophisticated argument, many societies separated the heads of these people from the rest of their bodies and decided to do without monarchy. And the prediction that the world would fall apart in the absence of monarchy turned out not to make a whole hell of a lot of sense. It didn't happen. It's sort of like the argument that the only way to decide who will be your spouse is to have your parents do that and work it out with the parents of somebody else.
I keep telling Matt
and
that.
And if ever you got to a society in which young people actually went out and found their own partners, the world would come to an end. They're too young. They don't know how the world works. works. Their hormones are too busy. It has to be the settled parents.
Now we realize
those
both
people,
versions are a disaster.
Yes, exactly. That those old people who have settled down to the living death that is old age, for some of us.
That's right.
And we now know that when you let young people go, they may not make the perfect marriage, but they really don't have a worse record than we had before. So the real question is, why would you want to assume that the king, who you don't want in your civil society, you do want in your workplace? Why would you want to keep the king inside the workplace when you got rid of him outside? What the hell's going on? Why would you make such an assumption? And that's all it is. It's the notion we have to have no democracy, top-down authority, a tiny number of people, board of directors in most corporations, maybe the owner of a business, maybe the one who started it, maybe his idiot son, who knows? But that we have to give the authority to a tiny number of people. It made no sense.
Well, excuse me.
Politics.
I'm sorry. I just need to push back. One day I do envision, very, very long time from today, that there will be a significantly more stupid version of this show that is carried on by my male heir. I'm working very hard on that. But Ben, does David Brooks have an answer to anything approaching the brilliance of what you just heard?
Well, what he says is socialist planned economies, the common ownership of the means of production, interfere with price and other market signals in a million ways. Now, what he's raising here is the socialist calculation problem, much debated in the 20s and 30s. What he's completely ignoring is that there's actually been a lot written about this in more recent decades by smart socialists like Mikhail Ruskowski and Leigh Phillips, who wrote a super interesting book called The People's Republic of Walmart, or Paul Cockshott, towards New Socialism, where socialists who know a lot about cutting edge technology and how, change in information technology could facilitate economic planning, give various answers to these. Now, the only kind of gesture he makes at knowing that this response exists is this sentence: it doesn't matter how big your computers are, the socialists can never gather all the relevant data, can never construct the right feedback loops. And I think it's really worth highlighting just how lazy that is. Doesn't matter how big your computers are. Because in 2019, that's really what we're looking at. That's how we evaluate changes in computer technology, how big they are. Right. They have I was talking about this with Nathan Robinson. He said this is on the eve of quantum computing. You're talking about how big the computers are. We're having this discussion in 1955.
I think he did nail us on the mainframe question.
Yeah, and he's also, of course, ignoring. Notice though that this whole critique assumes, and this is the most important point I want to make, that this whole critique assumes that what our options are, capitalism as we know it, more or less, maybe we could have a little few reforms around the edges he'd be okay with, but more or less capitalism as we know it, that's one option, or else fully planned economies with nothing like a market in sight. And that must be what people, are talking about socialism. That must be what they're talking about. Never mind that he quotes Michael Waltz earlier, who's certainly not talking about that, who certainly has a much more grounded vision of what an immediately post-capitalist society could look like. Maybe the state ownership of what is sometimes called the commanding heights of the economy, combined with workers' cooperatives and other sectors. But notice this dichotomy goes out the window in this later paragraph where he says, you've noticed the places that institute market reforms like South Korea, Deng Xiaoping's China, tend to get richer and prouder. Places that move towards socialism, Britain in the 1970s, Venezuela more recently, tend to get poorer and more miserable. So this is the part that really confuses me, because in his anti-socialist arguments earlier, he seemed to be assuming that the only sort of non-capitalist society that's possible is one where we have fully planned, completely marketless, advanced stage socialism. Otherwise, if we can't make that work this second because the computers aren't big enough, apparently, then we've got to stick with capitalism. But now he seems to think there's a range, right? That while Britain in the 70s or Venezuela more recently are more socialist than these other societies, and bad things happened there. Therefore, this is an indictment of socialism. And if we're going to say that there's a range, that we can have more socialist and less socialist as a matter of degree, then these are bizarrely cherry-picked examples. What about the Nordics? That are all even France. You guys were talking about it in the main show, right? France today has a bigger public sector than Venezuela had at the height of the Chavez welfare state. And I don't think I think most Venezuelans would rather live in France. And
that's also because of our interference in a place like Venezuela. But Professor Wolff's going to jump in now too. My unfortunate namesake, even though he's older than me, I'm claiming primacy in Brooks, is pissing Professor Wolff off.
Yeah, because the level of ignorance here, even in my experience, and I have a long, complex experience with ignorance, my own and other people's, but even given all of that, this is really monumental. You have to take your hat off, not only to Mr. Brooks, but to the editors at the New York Times for having made such a stunning selection for their editorial page. Let's just begin with a few things. No one has abolished the market. The market existed in the Soviet Union throughout its history. The market existed in China throughout its history. Huge numbers of transactions were handled with a supply and demand interaction in markets. That was a decision that was made. The notion of an economy without any market applies at best to a very short period of time, about a year or two after the Russian Revolution, in something which they called war communism, and which was really about a kind of requisitioning system that is fought in war. By the way, in wartime, markets are routinely put aside. Right. In the United States, we had a rationing system that was not a market system, where you could only get chocolate and milk and gasoline and coffee and meat with a ration card that was distributed by the United States government for a very simple reason. You could not let the market function, because if you did, all the resources that had been taken to fight World War II meant that you couldn't produce consumer goods the way you had before. And if the market worked, the only people who could buy scarce consumer goods would be the people who bid up the price and had the money. And it was decided in Washington that if only rich people got all the scarce consumer goods and the mass of people were made to suffer, that the unity for the war would be compromised. And so we got rid of the market and we handed out ration cards, which is what you needed to get those things. And you'll love to be told, I hope, and the irony of this you should enjoy, that the way the government distributed ration cards was to each family according to its need. If you had a lot of children, you got milk ration cards. And if you didn't have a lot of children, but you had a lot of cats, you didn't get ration cards. So the notion that markets didn't exist in these society is a caricature in the minds of these people, which they're so ignorant that they portray as if it were a real option or a real story. China likewise has made use of markets. The question is, how do you mix market allocations with non-market allocations? And that's been a problem in the United States too. Every family in the United States allocates products, resources, and labor. And guess what? They don't use a market. You don't sit down for dinner and bid for who gets the chicken leg that your mother prepared. She distributes it to you under a different non-market system. And if you, in fact, began to propose over the dinner table that the market be brought in to allocate resources, labor, and products inside your family, your mother or father would probably lean across the table, smack you in the face, and give you the following lecture. This is a family he or she would say. We do things for one another because we love each other and care for each other. You're introducing money into a situation that destroys its romance, destroys its emotion, destroys love. And I've always loved that story because here's a thought. If the introduction of a market destroys love inside the household, gee, maybe it does that outside the household too.
To be fair,
I would, yeah. I mean,
David Brooks was a militant socialist when he was younger, so
yes,
he probably.
I love the idea that he was a socialist before he learned how it worked. You might have thought it would be wiser for him to say to himself that he was a socialist and had studied a little bit how it worked before he made the commitment. But he didn't. He made the commitment, then he studied how it worked and decided it wasn't appropriate.
Yeah.
That suggests a person whose procedure in reaching to conclusions leaves a lot to be desired.
So what else do we have, Ben? Take us through the last.
Yeah, so I just want to say, because I think like a certain kind of, libertarian or conservative hate watching this segment on YouTube, might think, okay, well, come on, a family is one thing, right? You have a small number of people who have an emotional attachment to each other. But of course, any kind of interaction between large numbers of people without those social attachments, those need markets. And this brings us back to the People's Republic of Walmart, and one of the best points that Phillips and Rosworski, the authors, make there, which is where the title comes from, which is that actually these mega corporations like Walmart and Amazon have larger internal economies than a lot of countries,
right.
And there isn't an internal market in sight. In fact, if you look at what happened to Sears, they tried to do exactly that, introduce an internal market, and it was a disaster, and it pretty much destroyed Sears. They should have the seat at the board of directors should have resembled what Professor Wolff just described at a dinner table, minus the part about love, maybe.
Right.
So it's also, I think. It's also worth saying that, because this is just as a matter of intellectual honesty, because we're talking about, in the Venezuela example, you say, okay, yeah, a lot of this is because of U.S. sabotage, sanctions, et cetera, and I think that's absolutely true. But then, of course, people might think that they have kind of a perch to sit on to reject all this there and say, no. You're trying to blame all these other things. It's because of the decisions of the Venezuelan government. Well, look, it's very hard to know exactly what the percentages are because we can't compare reality to a version where we didn't have those sabotage and that sanctions. But what we, but the fact is, no matter what your explanation is for the Venezuelan economic meltdown, no matter how you assign weight to those different factors, bottom line, there are a lot of countries in the world that have gone a lot further in the direction of nationalizing industries, having an expansive welfare state than Venezuela has, that not only do not have economic meltdowns, but rank among always making it the top few in those world happiness surveys. So it seems like, I don't think we need to go through every last bit of David Brooks's increasingly less interesting reflections on socialism here. But I think the point is just that he has to pick. Either we can play the game that right-wingers always play here and say, well, none of these successful examples of social democracies count. Right? It doesn't matter how many nationalized enterprises you have in Norway, because it's still basically a capitalist country. So nothing that happens there is relevant to capitalism versus socialism. But if you say that, then you can't use Venezuela today or Britain in the 70s as anti-socialist examples. And in fact, if we're really going to be purist about definitions, you also can't bring up the Soviet Union. On the other hand, if you are going to say there's a spectrum here, and it all counts, then you can't just cherry pick the two examples you like you have to look at the extremely successful social democracies that, for all the critiques we can make of their limitations, and say to really secure these gains, we have to go further than social democracy and democratize the economy. I agree with all that. But nevertheless, we're talking about some of the societies that have done the most to secure human well-being of like any countries in human history. And if he started to consider those, then I think that he'd have to go back to his 22-year-old views.
Yeah, he'd have to go look up a mainframe. Final word, Professor Wolff.
Yeah, there's two things. Socialism, if you look at Marx and folks like that who are leading exponents of what this is all about, I'm going to say it now in as blunted terms as I can in the interest of time. They don't have much to do with the government. This is a modern notion that the government doing things is some kind of definition of socialism. If you read Marx's Capital, the critique of capitalism has to do with a division of people in the process of production between a minority that are employers and a majority that are employees, and that this is seen as capitalism's version of the similar dichotomy between lords and serfs in feudalism and masters and slaves in slavery, and that socialism is the negation of those kinds of dichotomies in favor of a different relationship in producing the goods and services we depend on, that of a community, hence the word communism, in which we democratically all together decide what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the fruits of our labor. Notice I haven't said a word about the government. That's a different issue. The only reason government looms large is the strategic decision in the 19th centuries of socialist movements to say to themselves and to the rest of the world, we're going to seize the government in order to use it to make the transition to socialism. But seizing the government isn't itself the transition to socialism. That's craziness, because socialism is a reorganization of the system of production of goods and services, and that's not a question of who does it, government or private. It's a question of how it's done, government or private. And a socialist society would have, presumably, both governmental and non-governmental democratic organizations of production. Mr. Brooks is so ignorant about the history of...
Sorry.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Please keep going.
He is so ignorant of the history of socialism that he has no idea and deals with this government, this fetishism of the government, as if it were a universally agreed truth. It never was. It isn't now. It's embarrassing that he lives in the bubble that requires affirming something so stone cold wrong.
And just to put another point on it, and this is for Forrest, this is a separate segment, but Ben, hang on a few minutes. I think this is really important. So unlike the libertarians, so you have a government which is still rooted in this, liberal democracies. And that's the idea basically that at least in the realm of governance, the realm of civil society, will evolve, we'll have a revolution, we'll get rid of monarchy. But in the private sector, we'll still have the divine right of kings, the divine right of the shareholder. Inside the enterprise. That's why they're fundamentally... I actually read a book once. It was a very interesting book by a business management theorist. And it was actually a critique of the trends in management consulting. There was a trend for a while in the 90s that was like, we need to democratize the workplace. Now, they didn't mean actually democratize the workplace. They meant make it friendlier, make people... And this critique was interesting because it wasn't Marxist, but he actually was making a delineation. He was saying, look, in politics, we have a democracy, and it is not business. And in business... this ain't a democracy. And we need to be clear about what those differences were. And there was actually a lot of integrity in that argument, even though I disagreed with some of it. But the point is not just that Marxists or socialists are trying so, and then libertarians say, oh, it's just the government. There's always this thing called government that just oppresses us. Yes. And it's not the government as an agent that is co-opted by the private divine rights of kings, which is how government works in most of the world. It's just an agent of the corporate sector. Marxists say, what happens if you seize the government and you didn't get rid of it? Obviously, there's always a government, but you also didn't just make the old mechanisms of government work a little bit more nicely. You said government is going to be reconstituted because we got rid of the divine right of king in the private sector. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
That's right. And that,
in
the book, I try very hard to make it clear that whatever you think about socialism, you have to be aware that there's basically the three kinds. One, the government regulates private enterprise and leaves it there. Two, the government becomes the enterprise owner-operator, the Soviet model, at least in hypothetical. And number three, that it's got nothing to do with the government. It has to do with a radical reorganization of work and all that means in the lives of people. With the government as an afterthought, it will be created the way capitalism did it, by getting rid of the old feudal government and reconstituting it on the basis of capitalism to serve capitalism. That's exactly what a democratized workplace economy will do for a new government that serves it.
Yeah, and I think that this is a point that's worth emphasizing because it's, in a weird way, it's kind of parallel to the way that like centrist Democrats like to accuse anybody who critiques them from the left of practicing purity politics. There's a way that in these discussions about what socialism has meant or could mean, people will sort of say, "Oh, you're just being like a purist about definitions, or you're being, you're playing no true Scotsman, maybe, that if something's bad, it's not socialist, And I think that's wrong for a couple reasons, but just for the sake of time, just to focus in on what's most relevant to what Professor Wolff is saying. That at the risk of pissing off tanky viewers who may be the only group more overrepresented on the internet as a percentage of the real world than libertarians are, the reason that I think it's important to differentiate out what we mean by socialism, what kind of socialism we have in mind from what existed in countries like the Soviet Union, isn't that nothing where anything went badly, or or that where there was a problem, or that where crimes were committed even could count as socialist. It's that the heart of the project, the whole point, is to extend democracy to the economy in order to create a classless society. If the government is, if you have the government as the owner of the means of production, or of some part of the means of production, well, maybe others are, owned by cooperatives or whatever. And I mean, this is a distinction that Ingalls, or one of my favorite Marxists, the Irish revolutionary James Connolly, talked about endlessly. That so that government ownership is socialism to the extent that the government is owned by ordinary working people. Because if that's the case, if you have radical bottom-up democratic control of the government, and then the government is controlling the means of production, then you don't have that distinction between a class of owners and a class of workers anymore. Whereas if the government is not controlled by the people, but it controls the means of production, then you don't have a classless society. You just have a new ruling class of state bureaucrats.
There it is. And then I think the next part of the conversation we'll have at a future date, hopefully not too far in the future, is different labor strategies and how they relate to all three of those paths. But I think that's very important, because the last thing I'll say, I've learned from Professor Wolff, and I think it's very clear in anybody we talk about on the show, like Thomas Sankara, whose birthday was just a couple days ago, is that it isn't just and really maybe this is actually a kind of, because I am a social democrat in the current context in terms of the ground we're on. That's where I'm at. But the shift is a broader, more aggressive strategic socialist view, is that you want to ultimately take over the power structures, not just ameliorate them so they're friendlier. And that is a fundamental outlook difference. And it also does challenge the idea that there does need to be those hierarchies, which I think we all actually really fundamentally reject. Anyways, Ben Burgess, give them an argument. Logic for the left. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you. See you next Friday.
See you next Friday. Or wait, is it next or the week after?
See, so
It's next, so we'll find out.
Yeah,
We're
yeah.
coming.
Well, Friday of next week. So
Perfect. All right, brother.
You know.
See you
All
soon.
right. Neither of us could do math.
Neither of us could do math. We reject math. I should say that on the Tuesday we're not going to be back from vacation, but we're going to have a show the first week of January. It's going to be on Friday, and Ben Burgess is going to be in studio, and Megan Day is going to be the guest over the phone. I'm very eager to do that.
I will see you there, or I will see you on another time.
Exactly. Do you have, Matt, 2 questions. Do you have the thread that Ryan Grimm did for the bad? And are you in the Discord to pick up some Discord questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Both of those answers are pretty much yes.
Excellent. Very well done, Matt. Let's start with let's start though with let's do the bad. Let's do the bad because this is important. The bad is the Trump sound for the bad, obviously. Do you have it?
Looks like it could be something that will be not good. Believe me, not good. No good, really bad for you. But it looks like it could be something that will be not good. Believe me, not good.
That was President Trump talking about a hurricane, and it's the opening of. Actually, could you play for Professor Wolff if it's handy? Donald Trump talking about the bad at the idea phase. Do you know what I'm talking about? Play him that, and then I want you to, Professor Wolff, will you play a little game with me?
Sure.
Will you guess what President Trump is talking about here in this sound drop?
Right, here's the first one. And these are all talking about the same thing.
These are all one event, and we're going to play it for you. You're going to guess what he's talking about.
Bad deal. Should have never been thought of.
All right, that's one.
And where it should have stopped is at the deal standpoint, where they thought about it.
That's two.
And they had the worst cover-up ever.
Any idea what he's talking about there? Bad idea where it should have been stopped from the deal stage was when they first thought of it. He is what?
NAFTA?
He's talking about the murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi. I'm sorry. So at any rate, we saw this against Jeremy Corbyn. And I think there's many lessons to be learned from what happened in the UK, including as following Paul O'Connell and Grace Blakely, that they should have respected the Brexit referendum and campaigned on a left Brexit. I think Professor Wolff's insights on what the working class is willing to fight for in today's era is maybe something to think about, as definitely something to think about. However, I think we need to also reinforce that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell were great leaders who really put tremendously good proposals on the table. And clearly, Jeremy Corbyn is a good person who was terrorized by a disgusting, dishonest, and also something we'd have to deal with for any type of socialist program, relentlessly dishonest and vicious misinformation-driven press, social media operations. And the anti-Semitism thing played a part against him. And now we're seeing it here in the United States with this scummy and profoundly dishonest Democrats Against Anti-Semitism Twitter group thread on Bernie Sanders' anti-Semitism. And it says, now Sanders may be ethnically Jewish, but his rhetoric, voting history, associations have not reflected the values of a friend of the Jewish people, but rather a coddler of anti-Semitic, racist, and sexist bullies and villains. Now, what does this mean when we go down into the thread? Could they be talking about the fact that Bernie Sanders has said on several occasions that Palestinians are human beings? Yes, I think we're going there. Then it goes to the 1970s, where Bernie Sanders was involved with the Marxist professor Michael Parenti. Now, I know that Michael Parenti, like many others on the left, was, of course, a critic of Israel, is a critic of Israel. I have never heard him say anything against the Jewish people as a whole. Have you ever heard Michael Parenti say anything anti-Semitic, Professor Wolff?
I've been on a half a dozen panels over the years with Michael Parenti. I'm familiar with his son, Christian Parenti, who teaches in New York City. It's just, that's what it is. It's pure, slanderous politicking in the hopes of separating a few Jewish votes from the Democratic Party and moving them either over to centrist Democrats from Bernie or over to Republicans. I mean, look at the kinds of things Jared Kushner says. You can get the same basic mention. To be critical of Israel is to be anti-Semitic. Jared said that. That's what they mean. That's all.
If you have any critic of Israel apartheid, you're anti-Semitic. Bernie Sanders has, and then they just basically go on to document other times that Sanders has spoken up for human rights in the Middle East. And I believe, if we go down, I believe they also talk about his support of Jesse Jackson's Rainbow Coalition, which I have to say some of these things are enormously helpful, I think, actually. Let's play this right here. This clip should be played of a great demonstration of Bernie Sanders demonstrating some consciousness in the 1980s, which was incredibly unusual.
In terms of the Middle East, I am comfortable with Jackson's position.
Which then became, by the way, everybody should know, in the 1980s, Jesse Jackson saying that the U.S. should negotiate with the PLO and Israel should negotiate with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was considered beyond the pale. Well, Bill Clinton did that several years later. Yes. And let's be very clear here, too. Jesse Jackson did say something anti-Semitic when he ran for president in 1984. He called New York Hymietown, which led to the great Eddie Murphy sketch, Don't Let Me Down, Hymietown. It's one of the funniest SNL sketches I've ever seen. And Jesse Jackson was wrong. It was objectively anti-Semitic. He apologized. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about speaking out for what actually became a failed but mainstream peace process in the Middle East. That's what Sanders supported. So anyways, you get the gist of it, how sleazy and disgusting and dishonest and misrepresentative this is. But who is behind all of this? You always have to say, no matter how small the group, anything like this screams of AstroTurf and misinformation. And that's why I want to go to Ryan Grimm, our friend over at The Intercept, who grabbed this very early. And we have some tweets from him, which you guys should all be retweeting and liking, because we need to be incredibly aggressive, pushing back against this shit and all of the dishonesty and sleaze that will get pushed at the Sanders campaign. Do we have the Ryan Grimm stuff? Ryan Grimm said, supporting the formation of the Palestinian state is used as evidence of anti-Semitism. Hell, even Netanyahu pretended to support it at some future date sometimes. But there are other ones that are more important that I hope we can get, where he says, okay, this is important. A foreign dark money group attacking Sanders, which gave itself away by not knowing American date customs, and put out some extremely expensive research that doesn't remotely prove the case that Sanders is anti-Semitic, but they're trying so hard. Now, he also, and you can look it up. They did get some dates wrong. Go to the date one. He has it up there. Click on that. Up above.
Up above.
There.
Oh yeah.
Foreign organizations plan to announce meddling in the Democratic primary starting on 22 December. Guys, if you're going to pose as American Democrats, at least take the time to get out the dating conventions down. Your foreign intervention in our election will begin on December 22nd. Okay? And he also asked them who's funding this group directly. At cancel_Sam, our friend on Twitter, wrote this. Check out this upcoming project. Very similar to quote unquote Labor Against Anti-Semitism account. This brand new account. Second follower is founder of Our Soldiers Speak, OSS. OSS website, Benjamin arranges briefings by senior IDF officials for members of the U.S. Congress. It's obvious what this is. And they are taking one of the most serious and poisonous things that has existed in human history, namely anti-Semitism, weaponizing it to destroy any basic decency in politics as represented by Corbyn and Sanders, and saying anybody that rightly opposes racism and apartheid in the Middle East is anti-Semitic. It's disgusting. It's really, really disgusting. And we got to be incredibly aggressive on this, because this is definitely the play they're going to try. Professor Wolff, we have a few more pieces of sound to take, but can you actually, well, first, Matt, do we have any Discord questions? Let's take a few Discord questions.
Why do you think, this is from Ben O'Leary, why do you think Trump's recent food stamp cuts aren't provoking the same popular pushback that austerity measures in France do?
Thoughts on that?
Well, it's the same thing I tried to say before. It's you don't have in this country a cultural sense in broad sectors of the population that these are all assaults on a whole vision of what a society should be like. You get much more here in the United States the feeling, okay, this is bad for people who get food stamps. Let them do something about it. It's not understood to be what it is, which is a broad-based assault by the Republicans. They've always done this. This is undoing the social reforms, which is what food stamps were. It's a support. It's like that story of Walmart having a special office in many of its stores to help the employees fill out the forms for food stamps. That's a subsidy to Walmart to get away with paying wages that don't allow you to have enough food. So now the government comes in and basically enables a Walmart worker to get by, even though Walmart is paying them too little. The assault on food stamps is part of the same mentality of assaulting the standard of living of the society as a whole, converting people who now get some food into people who won't have that food. The whole mentality, which is disgusting to the large numbers of liberal and left people, is still not yet understood the way in France these things are understood. That's an assault on all of us. It's another effort of the patronat to change this society into a nation of a few rich and a vast. And as long as that happens, you pick off whichever victim you want, and you don't have the risk of the response. That's a question of developing in our schools, in our churches, in our public media, the kind of culture, and let's say it, a we-they culture, we the people, and they, the oppressors, the capitalists, the employer class, which is what funds the Republican Party, what funds the centrists of the Democratic Party. That's who they are. They want a society that's atomized in the way they have achieved so that they can do what they're doing. And we have to understand. Look, some people love to go back to that Powell memorandum some decades ago, where you get the right-wing kind of understanding that the mentality of the Great Depression was a mentality that private capitalism had collapsed, and the government and the unions and the left-wingers are what's saving us. That had to be undone as a cultural way of thinking. And they worked very hard at that, and we have to understand that unless we do that job the other way, we're going to live with first the food stamps go, then the minimum wage isn't raised for 10 years, all the things we see which don't get the generalized response that would make them stop.
Go back to the opening commentary of tonight's show, sympathy versus solidarity. And that guts to the core of even the response of people have absolutely the right moral response, which is that it's grotesque, it's disgusting, it's evil. But they're not centered, as what Professor Wolff said, that this is a threat to everyone. It's a symbol of the barbarism. It's a symbol of the attack.
Look, the mentality, if I could just add.
Yes.
In December 2017, you pass a spectacular tax cut that goes mainly to large corporations and the richest people. It is a gift of tens of billions of dollars to the people who've done the best in the last 25 years in America. The big corporations, the stock market, the shareholders. There is no justification for it, and it gets passed, and almost no one says, what's the cost of this? Fast forward, we're going to cut 1 million people off of food stamps, and the explanation offered by the government, which thinks it can get away with it, and probably can. Gee, we have to wonder how much it costs to... What? That food stamp program doesn't hold a candle to the cost of that tax cut. It goes to the people who need it most, whereas the tax cut went to the people who need it least. It is grotesque. And if there were a cultural understanding, in this society, that wouldn't fly because too many people would see that it's an outrage against us, the culturally formed us, and can't be allowed. The way the Powell Memorandum kind of helped conservative business types see everything that the New Deal was as an assault on them, requiring everybody in every town who's a business employer to get together and support the pushing back against what the New Deal had represented.
More Discord questions, then we'll do a couple of pieces of sound.
It's from K-State Nate. My 12-year-old's niece's birthday is coming up, and she reads a lot. What would a good book be for her birthday to indoctrinate her to the left?
For her 12-year-old, huh? I don't know. You have any ideas? I have no doubt, and this might be, I'm not sure age or. I was super into Robin Hood. That probably had something to do with my politics.
Yeah. That would be a great thing.
Yeah.
Robin Hood would be a great thing. If she's a precocious reader, there's a fantastic book called The Count of Monte Cristo, the story of a man like Les Miserables in France. It's a French book, but it's in English, about a man falsely accused and imprisoned, and how he understands that he is the victim of a large social misjudgment and crime. And that teaches you how to think. It's so important in America that these problems are not your personal issue or particularly your personal fault. That things that happen to you can be reasonably assigned social causes, which therefore need social responses. That teaching the American people that a social problem is not solved by an individual act, that if you want to solve a social problem, you got to have a social movement. This basic understanding, some of these books get across.
Any others, Matt? Okay, all right. Let's.
Yeah. I could do one more here.
Yeah, do one more, then we'll do the sound.
This is from a waterboat from Kashmir. After the most recent election in India, a fleet of private jets flew across the country to help form Modi's mandate and local BJP governments. These planes are owned by billionaire industrialists who also fund BJP and even some opposition Congress. How do you fight this?
I mean, how do you fight this? Well, one thing I will say from my conversation with Prashad, which actually has been encouraging me, is it actually is being fought. And it seems like it's some combination. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've been telling people this, and correct me if I'm wrong, that of course Marx was moral in the sense that he did not want to have an undemocratic, unjust, cruel world that formed his politics to a great degree. But another reason he had such an interest in the working class as a category is that that's the one area where there's power on the other side.
That's right.
If the other side has all the money, they've got all the private jets, they've got all the power, they've got the television stations, the cops, whatever, what do people have? I mean, and it is amazing how the equation flips, because when I was looking up Macron stories before we talked about it, yes, I had to print that great New York Times headline, but there are other mainstream outlets, quote unquote mainstream outlets, saying, is Macron losing his grip? Is he about to go? And it's exactly because, it is literally because the one area people have at countervailing power is that. Now, different conditions. I think this is another reason why people have to be much more serious about Trump, some people on the left here, because you don't want to get to a situation where a more and more neo-fascistic order comes up against that. That's why you actually do, as a leftist, have to fight for those liberal reforms, quote unquote, to the extent that they exist. And you need to be really aware of state legislation against protesters, like you saw after the Doppel protests. But anyways, I'm going all over the place, but that's my answer. And I know it's not easy, but the answer to private jets and billions of dollars is the mass of people.
Yeah, let me be as blunt as I can. The working class is what makes everything go. The people at the top give the orders, but the orders only matter if the people below them take them. And the minute those people say, you're not giving orders anymore, the game is over. the power in the end is actually with the people. They have had it all along. They just didn't know it. They didn't understand that the system comes to a stop. Look at France. Nothing moves in the country. The subways don't go, the buses don't go, the trains don't go, and Mr. Macron is being assaulted. Business community is furious at having lost their Christmas season, which for many retailers is the crucial time of year, because this great leader could not figure out how to manage what it is he's supposed to do. They don't want to hear from him that there's these nasty people that are protesting. That's his job, is to manage them, and he can't do it. They don't want to face the fact that it may be because the mass of people are not about to do what has to be done for this capitalist society to go on. So yes, the little bits of money and the refusal to work, that's what the working class has always had, and that's an enormous power which, if you can harness it and focus it, there's no limit to what can be done.
Oh, okay. That's excellent. All right. I almost wish we ended on that, but I do want to do three pieces of sound real quick. Let's start with Pete Buttigieg. This is funny. A lot of people have been, look, I think that, as I've said many times, I think Pete Buttigieg has emerged as the greatest overall threat to, if Joe Biden becomes the nominee of the Democratic Party or president, we're going to have every fight imaginable, but it would simply be an exhausted expression of a lot of people who want desperately to go back to what they deem to be normal. And I think even as we totally disagree with it, we should have sympathy for that. And there's a huge fight ahead. I think with Buttigieg, there's the huge fight ahead, but there's this depressing, collapsed reality of such a young candidate reaffirming such dead ideas. I think there's something uniquely, historically problematic with that. And I think, he's been really getting beat up the last couple of days. Let's just play these two clips because it's an interesting juxtaposition. Kyle Kulinski had a tweet out earlier, which was something I'm paraphrasing, but like the sleeper surprise of 2020 campaign so far is that I don't hate Julian Castro. And I think that is exactly my same sentiment. Julian Castro, who does not have a good record at Obama's HUD at all, has been someone who's actually spoken incredibly clearly on racism and policing, on the border and immigration and the humanity of immigrants. And I've appreciated some of the things he's put on the board. And here he is. I think this is not unique to him. I think everybody clearly does not like Pete Buttigieg up there in the primary. Here he is talking about Pete Buttigieg. And then we have an old back in time piece where Pete Buttigieg appears to be sharing Julian Castro's perspective.
Campaign. I think we're first or second in terms of the highest percentage of small dollar donors. And my average contribution is something like $20 for the lifetime of the campaign. I don't take any PAC money, no federal lobbyist money, no big oil and gas money, and so forth. All of us have gotten contributions that are $1 and contributions that are $2,800, right? But it's what do you do with that? And when it comes to Mayor Buttigieg, I do think that it's concerning that he started off this race just a few months ago saying that he was basically all in with Medicare for all, and then he flip-flopped. And now says that he's not for that. And a few months ago on the debate stage... Do you think that's in part
because of his donors or his donor base?
I think that raises a legitimate question of what is influencing in such a quick time, such a short time, when you have these big health insurance industry contributions to his campaign and other campaigns. What's influencing that flip-flop?
Okay, well, I think it's a good point. I know that the current Pete Buttigieg would strenuously object with a very over-rehearsed, contorted body language of a 2004 Democrat. But here's a younger Pete Buttigieg running for state treasurer in the state of Indiana. By the way, this race he lost by over 20 points with his supposed specialty in winning in the Midwest. Here's Pete Buttigieg in the time machine on campaign contributions.
Anything else you'd like to talk about? Anything you had in mind?
I think today is the day when campaigns release their finance numbers, and everybody puts their cards on the table for the last quarter. And it's highlighted something I think is really important in this race, and is very important certainly to my campaign. And that is that I think we need to get special interest money out of the Treasury's race. Right now, there are almost no rules constraining the ability of, say, Wall Street banks to pump large sums of money into state treasurers' campaign. And having looked at my own finances and seen what's happening in my opponent's race, I've noticed that thousands of dollars are flowing in from some of the biggest banks in the country in order to defeat me. It's not just that they're trying to defeat me that I'm bothered by this, but very early on in this campaign, I made a decision that I wasn't going to accept any money from a bank that could be doing business with the state treasurer's office. I think it creates a conflict of interest. It creates an appearance, at the very least, that can smell like pay to play.
All right, so I think we have it. But I guess, to be fair, which is that phrase that I hate because I don't necessarily like to be fair, maybe not appropriate for Indiana Treasury Secretary, but totally appropriate for President of the United States. What do you make of Buttigieg? Do you have any thoughts on him for a moment, or not even worth it?
I'm always hesitant. I worked quite a while with Pete Buttigieg's father,
right?
A Marxist intellectual, a professor of literature at Notre Dame University. Remarkable that Notre Dame had a Marxist professor, openly Marxist, a follower and a user of the work of Antonio Gramsci as his great influence. Pete Buttigieg grew up in a household he knows very well what leftist thinking is. He had a teacher in his own father. My understanding is they were close. So he knows exactly what he is choosing to keep as far away from himself as he can. So you've got a person, there is no ambiguity, there's no ignorance, he wants to be like the center of the Democratic Party. He has made the decision not to go to a left that he's very familiar with, that he was deeply close to, like a son to a father. And so I think it's important to understand this is a centrist Democrat by conviction, by choice, and my understanding is he's been that way a long time. This is not a recent conversion. This is not an adjustment to he has imagined himself being the young centrist Democrat. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that the center can hold, disconnect itself from the old people like the Clintons or even the Obamas, and that a new young version of this is what he wants to be.
The same thing in the new packaging.
That's right. But people should not, this is not an adjustment being made to get through a tortuous primary race. This is who he is. He is a centrist, and he has been all along, and he's chosen not to be part of the left in any way, whether it's his religious commitments, his service in the military, and all of that. That's who he is.
That's who he is. All right, two more pieces of sound and one final Discord question. I thought this was very significant. We'll do AOC first, then Cornel West. I think the fact that she said this is very significant on foreign policy. Obviously, a lot of this show is globally oriented, and the connections between foreign and domestic are significant. Also, again, the name checks of Palestinian humanity are both enormously important and positive in terms of the evolution of our project and our politics and the positive role that the unparalleled role the Sanders campaign is playing. This also will be more ammunition for outside influence peddlers and sleaze against this campaign. This is AOC in Venice 2 days ago.
That foreign policy is also domestic policy for so many of us, for our families, for people who have families abroad. And he knows that whether it's here at home with Puerto Rico or out abroad in Palestine, that human rights are for everyone. The right to clean water, the right to access medicine. None of these things are controversial. That foreign policy.
So So foreign policy is domestic policy. I just want to say really briefly that I have been someone, obviously I think AOC is great, and she's done an enormous positive role in terms of our domestic politics and endorsing Sanders. Foreign policy has been something I've been critical of her on, with Venezuela as an example. And I think that this is both clearly where she wants to go because of her politics and her inclination and because she's a good leader. But I also think, people have to give credit to themselves for starting to mobilize around the international dimension. And I think, and I'm seeing that, and I think we're playing a little bit of a role in that. Let's play this final clip. This is Mehdi Hassan with Cornel West talking about the sort of cancel culture thing. And as always, I think Cornel West has a very profound and important perspective on it. And I just, Professor Wolff, if you could, after this clip, touch on, obviously, Dr. West is a Christian socialist. And I am someone who is a, big believer that the spiritual and the religious has to be a part of a broader left coalition argument, whatever. But I'm also a big believer that some of the things that he's putting forward here in his system as Christian, that there are corollaries in an entirely secular way as well. That this same generosity of spirit, the same maturity, the same bigness of vision can manifest in a variety of different ways and needs to if we want to actually build the kind of solidarity we're talking about. So I'd like maybe some thoughts on it after we play this clip.
Could I get the sound?
And we'll get the sound so Professor Wolff can hear it.
A major criticism you hear among some black leaders, among some black politicians and activists these days, is the way in which so-called wokeness and call-out culture, quote unquote, have become substitutes for genuine action, for social movements that you yourself have always believed are necessary for change. Do you share that criticism? It's come from different corners, from people associated with Black Lives Matter, from Barack Obama, from other people saying, you have to get out there. It can't just be going on Twitter and calling people out. Do you agree with that criticism, or do you think it's unfair?
Well, I think the first thing to say is fundamentally it's not about identity. It's about solidarity. It's not about your skin pigmentation. It's about the quality of your courage connected to poor and working people. I don't believe in canceling anybody. I mean, Christians don't believe in canceling people. Everybody can bounce back. I believe everybody's a brother and sister, and they have the capacity to be changed and transformed. So I don't believe in canceling anybody whatsoever. But I do, in fact, say that when we talk about wokeness, I'm not talking about just being woke, because you can be obsessed with wokeness and suffer from insomnia. I'm talking about being fortified. Are you a fighter in the long run? We don't want people woke and sprinters and run out of gas, and the next thing you know, they end up well-adjusted to injustice. That's like so much of the bourgeoisies, no matter what color they are. Middle-class folks that just can't wait to be engaged in upward mobility in order to go mainstream and become a new star with all the spectacle and overlook what's going on the ground of people who are suffering. That's not the model. The model is Martin King, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Ella Baker. What are they talking about? Fortified. Are you fortified for the long run? Do you have your cemetery clothes on? Are you coffin ready to live and die for something bigger than you, like a fundamental transformation of a capitalist civilization? That's my tradition.
One last question, Cornel West. Looking forward 5 or 10 years, do you think we'll still be having these same conversations in the United States?
Oh, wait, you can end it now, actually. Yeah, that was the other point. Are you fortified, Professor Wolff?
I sure hope so. And I must say, and I think Cornel would agree, and perhaps we can have a conversation with him in the near future.
We're working on it.
Yes. That he is a fighter. He is somebody who's not, he is a professor, and he understands the importance of teaching. He is a teacher across the board. He admires Martin Luther King basically because he was a teacher too, even though he was a minister, but it was teaching that he did. And I think he's that thing which we don't understand, which is He's an intellectual who's an activist. It's not either or. He's an academic who's an activist. He's active in academia, but outside it as well. He doesn't accept that there's a boundary that limits his activism, and there's no boundary that limits his teaching function. It's not just in the classroom. It's in the church or on the street, and he's been wonderful that way. And teaching by his own example as a model that you can be thoughtful, studious, read books, and be an active, fortified, long-run fighter at the same time. And I think if he were here, I can't speak for him, obviously, but if he were here, he would tell you that it's his study that helps him be the activist. It's his activism that guides his study, and that's how it should be. It's not either. The separation is one of those divisions, the boundaries and disciplines, in the worst sense of that word, that have to be overcome. He, like me, and I've talked with him about this, we're horrified by the way American universities are organized, these rigid boundaries. Political science is here, history is over here. I remember when I was a student, I raised my hand to ask a question, had my teacher tell me, oh, you got to ask that to another professor. That's not nonsense. These boundaries are artificial and inhibit the bringing together of insights from different fields, which is what you need to do good intellectual work, just like you need to know what's going on in the society to do good intellectual work, and you need good study habits and experience to make good decisions in your activism. We need to bring these things together and not have some crude division of labor that hampers everybody.
Dr. West is our model on so many things. What was that, Matt? You had some late-breaking positive news that you put out?
Well, Bolsonaro appears to have fell in the shower or something and gone to the hospital, but I took it down because it doesn't appear to be a serious injury. So.
Oh, that's too bad. I will say
we should, a Christmas miracle.
You should throw up Lula playing soccer on Twitter. That's a good contrast. He's out playing celebration soccer. All right, final Discord question, and then we're out of here. It's a final question.
TMBS. Here we go. My country's trying to introduce this is Angela from Australia. My country's trying to introduce a cash ban. I think they want the max to be $1,000. Can the professor tell me why?
A what ban?
A cash ban. I don't know what that. Maybe we can.
Wait, you can't have any cash above $1,000?
Yeah, I don't know what exactly.
I don't understand.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know what
I'm sorry. Please try us again. Sorry.
Maybe just spell it out next time a little more if that person could re-enter it.
Yeah, I'm just not quite sure what the specificity of that means. Let's see, what else, other questions that we have?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Try us again. Sorry.
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, that's it. Yeah. All right. Professor Wolff, thank you so much as always. Everybody buy Understanding Socialism. Professor Wolff will be back with us in the new year, and I might be returning to Economic Update as well.
Absolutely.
It's always just an honor. I appreciate it.
And thank you for having a program like this, which that's what we need. We need lots of them. And this is a major way to spread the word and to not be hampered by mainstream media's rigid, narrow rules. So it's my hat's off to you as much as I can do without wearing one.
I'm honored. Guys, I appreciate all of you so much. That's how we do what we do. Thank you for everything. All gratitude and appreciation. Thanks to the whole team. We will see you the first Friday of the new year. Very excited for everything. Very excited for 2020. There's a lot for us to do. And moving forward, appreciate you all. Thank you. Good night.